Morning. Good to see each and every one of you here today. We're thankful for those that are visiting with us. We hope you feel welcome. We also hope you'll feel free to ask questions you may have regarding things that I might say or what we do as a congregation, or any needs that you have regarding your own relationship with God and further study that you might want in that regard. We'll be glad to assist in whatever way we can. So we see these passages like Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 29 that address the matter of the things that we say and how we need to be concerned about that, and that as a Christian we shouldn't just think in terms of, we're just going to talk like we always talk and just say whatever comes to our mind, or whatever things that we're not even going to think that has any bearing on our relationship with God. There's a passage in James chapter 1 and verse 26 that uses a terminology that's both an image as well as a reminder of how significant it is. And that's the term bridling the tongue. In James chapter 1 and verse 26, he says, "If any among you thinks he is religious and does not bridle his tongue, he deceives his own heart, and this one's religion is useless." Now, we think about the way that he's really applying this and letting us know that we can deceive ourselves if we don't think it's important that we change our speech to match the life that we have in Christ. So, we can think about that terminology, bridling the tongue. I mean, I think of a bridle, I immediately think of a horse. I think about having a bit in the horse's mouth. I think about, keeping a rein on our tongue. I don't know who drew that. It wasn't me. Maybe give you a little bit of a visual there to think about bridling the tongue, keeping it in check, keeping a rein on it. And Jesus addressed this in many places. In Matthew chapter 12 and verse 36, he says, "I say to you that for every idle word men may speak, they will give account of it in the day of judgment. For by your words you will be justified, and by your words you will be condemned." Now we know there's a problem sometimes if someone's just all words and no action. If all they are is they say things and something never happens, we have a name for that: a politician. But it's not a good thing when somebody says things but they don't follow up on what they say. And we see that in all kinds of ways, but especially as it relates to those that we might interact with and such. But there's also this thing of somebody thinking, well, then it doesn't really matter what you say. It just matters what you do. No, it does matter what you say. It does matter the words that come out of your mouth. And Jesus could not have made it any plainer. That there is an accountability not just for actions, but for words. And what he expects us to say and not say. Proverbs chapter 10 verse 31 says, "The mouth of the righteous brings forth wisdom, but the perverse tongue will be cut out. The lips of the righteous know what is acceptable, but the mouth of the wicked what is perverse." That's almost a description of much of the conversation that goes on in our world today. It's perverse. It's things that are just not what they should be. People talking about things they have no business talking about. People using words that they have no business using, especially when we think about one who's a Christian. It used to be, and I don't think it was that long ago, or maybe I'm just deceiving myself in as far as my age goes, but there was especially a courtesy, even by those who used all kinds of foul language, that they were courteous around women. And that almost doesn't exist anymore. In fact, sometimes it's coming out of the mouth of the women. And it's not the way it should be. And while it might be what's going on in the world, we need to think about that in regard to the things that we say, not only in specific words, but in the content of things that we're talking about. Jesus, you might remember this passage in Matthew chapter 15, where Jesus is talking about the people who were making a big deal and calling it sin if people ate without washing their hands. Remember that? And he got on them pretty hard and said that they were taking things that were traditions and making it as if it's the law of God. He used a quote from Isaiah. "Well did Isaiah prophesy of you, saying, 'This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. But in vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. And he applied it the way they were taking their traditions and making it as if it was from God. And he said, and he also made a point of how that they were completely disregarding the law of God in regard to care of their elderly by saying, oh, well, what I was going to take care of you, I've given it to God. I can't take care of you, Mom and Dad. And he said, you're not honoring your parents in that way. But he goes on in that same context, and he says that it's not what goes into the mouth, but what comes out of the mouth that defiles the man. And then he says this in verse 18. But for those things which proceed out of the mouth those things which proceed out of the mouth come from the heart, and they defile the man. So he's also bringing out another important thing. And this, we know this. We know that our mouth doesn't just move without getting some direction from our mind. And what Jesus is also bringing into it is that this is an indication of where our heart is. And he says, out of the heart proceed evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornications, thefts, false witness, blasphemies. But he's saying these are also the source of what's coming out of the mouth versus what's going into the mouth in the way that the Pharisees were applying that. In Matthew chapter 12, he says something also very similar when he says, a good man out of the good treasure of his heart brings forth good things, and an evil man out of the evil treasure brings forth evil things. By the way, the very next verse is the one we first read from Matthew 12, which is every idle word that men shall speak, he'll give account of in the day of judgment. For by thy words thou shalt be justified, and by thy words thou shalt be condemned. So he's really saying this is an indication, and it tells us something's got to kind of change much deeper than just the surface of what's there, but what's underneath it to begin with. And I think that's why we find places that encourage us to really focus on keeping good things in our mind, whether it's about us spending time in God's Word or meditating on important things. You find this in Philippians chapter 4 and verse 8 when he says, finally, brethren, whatever things are true, whatever things are noble, whatever things are just, whatever things are pure, whatever things are lovely, whatever things of good report, if there's any virtue, if there's anything praiseworthy, meditate on these things. Let me also say that I think by listing these things like this, it can also allow us to say, okay, if these are things that I'm thinking about, or these are things that I'm listening to, or these are things that I'm watching on a program, do they fit that category? Or are they things that really are far from what's listed here as things that are true and noble and just and pure and lovely and good report and full of virtue and praiseworthy? So sometimes we just have to change the habits about what we're programming in there that can also be that way. So why is it so important that we be careful about the things that we say? You'll notice in the book of James, and this is also probably one you've already thinking about when we quoted from James 1:26, which is the reference to the importance of putting application on our self-discipline and things that we say. Now he begins the chapter by saying, my brethren, let not many of you become teachers, knowing that we shall receive a stricter judgment, for we all stumble in many things. If anyone does not stumble in word, he's a perfect man, able also to bridle the whole body. Obviously, if we're going to teach people about Jesus, we're going to have to pay careful attention to what we're saying. Not only in being careful not to say things that are not appropriate and not truthful, but also that we say things that we do say, the things that need to be said. And as he's saying this, he says, he makes a point here, and it's something that I think everybody can relate to. We realize we stumble in words. We sin with our tongue because sometimes we either say things we shouldn't say or don't say things we need to say. And it's a tough thing to address. And he emphasizes this in a number of things throughout this chapter. And I want you to continue reading with me from the book of James. I didn't give you a page number yet, but we're going to look at several verses that are here that relate to the principle of the value and the importance of being careful about the things that we say. And I hope we can put this into our own thinking. None of this is really about you looking at other people, although I've made some reference to some of the things that we hear, way we hear people talk. This should primarily be that we're thinking about this in regard to our own selves and the things that we say and don't say. But if you pick up there in verse 3, he says, page number is 839 if you're using the Pew Bible. James chapter 3, beginning in verse 3. He says, we put bits in horses' mouths that they may obey us, and we turn the whole body. I find it very consistent that he mentions the need to bridle our tongue in chapter 1, and then as he brings this subject up in more detail, he immediately talks about bits in horses' mouths. So we put bits in their mouths that they may obey us and turn the whole body. Now, sometimes you can have a horse that's well trained, and you can use just a halter and you can lead him around. Or I've even seen some people have horses that they can just direct without even any kind of a bit or a halter or anything else on. But I've also seen horses that are pretty stubborn, that you get a bit in their mouth, and they're all of a sudden kind of compliant, because this has that ability. And so he's making this point here about, even though you have these horses that are many times stronger than a man, if it was strictly strength competition, the strongest is the one that rules, we wouldn't stand a chance against horses. And yet we can use horses for working, we can use them for pulling things, we can use them for recreation or taking us places across the mountains. And this bit can be very useful to doing that. And so he really emphasizes, here's this small little bit that's in the mouth that controls the whole body. And as we think about that, we can say that kind of thing that's there, that's so, the tongue, our mouth, compared to all the rest of our body, is a very small thing, but it controls the direction of our life. It's how people know us. It's how people know whether they can trust us or not. It's about whether or not they're going to be able to communicate and get to know us. And he makes a point here in verse 7. He says, every kind of beast and bird, of reptile and creature of the sea is tamed and has been tamed by mankind, but no man can tame the tongue. It's an unruly evil full of deadly poison. I don't think he's not getting away from his whole point about bridling the tongue. I think he's saying we can't ever just turn it loose. We've got to always keep that bridle on there, or we'll end up saying things we shouldn't say. We need to make sure that we're aware that if we do so complacently in the way we approach our tongue, we're going to be in a dangerous position, because we'll end up saying things that can be not only harmful, but sometimes absolutely devastating to the life of other people and their relationship with God, and many other things along that line. There's numerous places that David is praying and asking God to help him with the things that he's saying, to control his tongue. Do you do that? Do you ask God to help you control your tongue? And not only that, to have the wisdom. And we're not going to go into this. I'll just say this ahead of time. We're not going to go into the latter part of chapter 3 that talks about worldly wisdom versus earthly wisdom. But I don't think that's disconnected with the idea of the tongue, because often it is about the things that we say that has to do with us needing to have good wisdom in what we say. So not only does he compare this to horses, though, he mentions all these other animals that have been I find it absolutely fascinating that in the first century, as this is written, he mentions they've been taming not only birds and beasts, but reptiles and creatures of the sea. We think about SeaWorld or something like this, where you got the shamus and you got the killer whales and you got the dolphins and you got the all those other creatures that they do. They train them to do things. It's amazing, right? I'm amazed by what they can get them to do. But apparently they were doing that back then. I don't know what they were doing with creatures of the sea and taming them, but apparently they were. But we have this issue with this tongue that can be completely unreliable if we turn it loose. He also mentions ships. He says in verse 4, look also at the ships. Although they're so large and driven by fierce winds, they're turned by a very small rudder wherever the pilot desires. You know, you think about the old tall ships that were driven by the wind. But we could also think about much more modern ships as well. They still have a rudder that's deciding where they go. And in comparison to the size of the ship, it's very small. It's just that little part at the back. My brother-in-law had a 18-foot Hobie cat. If you don't know what that is, it's a catamaran, has 2 holes and then a tarp in between it, kind of a trampoline. And then you have the keels that go down in the middle of the holes and keep it there. And one of the things you can do with a Hobie cat is if you get enough wind, you can sail. You can do what they call fly a hull. You actually get one hull out of the water and you're riding on one hull. But you still got to. It's actually got 2 rudders because they don't know which hull you're going to have in the ground. So this is. I mean, which one's going to be in the water? So we're going along here, and it's a pretty windy day, and we're having a lot of fun, just me and my brother-in-law, and he's got himself tied to this cable. He's wearing this little harness, and he's got himself tied to the cable, and he's doing what's called hiking out. He'd stand up on that hull because we'd have to put a lot of weight on the hull that's up in the air so it doesn't flip over. And I've got this rudder, and I'm pulling the rudder, and the more I pull on the rudder, because we're doing what's called tacking, so the more we kind of head in, the faster we go, and I'm loving it, you know. And I get to loving it a little bit too much. And I flip it. And he goes, slaps on the water, you know. But I think about that when I think about just how powerful that one little rudder, not anything compared to the sail, the 30-foot sail, not anything compared to the length of the hull, it didn't compare to any of these other things. And yet that rudder, it was not only determining the direction, it also flipped us because of the power that was there in the control of that. Believe it or not, he still let me steer the thing after that. I don't know. But with a little instruction, you know. But they certainly, the point of that is something's easy to see. He's making the point. He's telling us, look, this is a small part of you, but it has tremendous consequences on what happens to your life. You can flip your life with things that you say. He also makes a comparison to fires. He says in verse 5, even so the tongue is a little member and boasts great things. See how great a forest a little fire kindles? And the tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity. The tongue is so set among our members that it defiles the whole body and sets on fire the course of nature, and it is set on fire by hell. So the comparison with the fires, you know, we know that can be a big problem here. I don't see Gary and Laura, who are often here. They had to leave their home for a few weeks, a few years ago, because of that big fire that came out from Big Bug and down to the direction of their house. We know that's an issue that comes up, but we're looking for that. Okay, who started it, right? How did this fire start? Was it a lightning strike? Was it somebody who had a campfire they didn't put out? Was it some spark off of an engine? Something very small started this. We know it. And so he makes that comparison to a way that things can be set aflame by things that are said, and lives can be destroyed by things that are said. Our words affect the direction of our lives. He says in Matthew chapter 27, verse 37, we read 12:37, we read a moment ago, by your words you'll be justified, by your words you will be condemned. This is about not only our relationship with God, but it also affects the relationships we have with other people. Proverbs 21 and verse 23 says, whoever guards his mouth and tongue keeps his soul from troubles. That gets back to that. We can't just turn it loose. We've got to be on guard about the things that we say. Proverbs 10 and verse 19 says, in the multitude of words sin is not lacking, but he who restrains his lips is wise. Don't think it's a drawback to be careful about what you say. It's an absolute beneficial thing to our life in a thing. And there's a number of things that are addressed throughout the Bible about specific sins of the tongue. Lying, of course, is one of those things. Just a few verses before the verses that Bill read for us a moment ago, in verse 25 of Ephesians chapter 4, it says, "Therefore, putting away lying, let each one of you speak truth with his neighbor, for we are members of one another." How important is that to you, that someone is a person of their word? What I mean is the people that you know and they tell you things and you say, I know, I can believe what they're telling me. And on the other hand, when there's somebody that has proven himself to be a liar, even as he may be attempting to correct that, there's always that question, okay, is he really telling the truth or not? You know, you try to teach that lesson when you tell kids about the little boy who cried wolf. You know, that I want to know that I can believe what you're saying. Look what happened to this guy. You keep saying things that aren't true, then I'm not going to believe you when you do tell me the truth. And sometimes it's the people who've had a reputation and a practice of being dishonest about things that get the most upset when people don't believe them, what they're saying, when it is true. We're doing a great disservice to our own self, but we're often doing a great deal of disservice to the people around us when we're not being truthful. And sometimes being truthful is something that's extremely painful. It's not the easy thing to do, to be truthful. Cursing. There's a description, the song that we sing, angry words, oh let them never from the tongue unbridled slip. May the heart's best impulse ever check them ere they soil the lip. You know, that's a great song that reminds us of the importance of being careful about the things we say. And I do think that there are a number of words that Christians need to get out of their vocabulary. And I know it can be difficult because of people we work around. I know it can be difficult because of our own habits. It can be difficult because of programs on TV. And don't think, I can watch that. It's not going to bother me. You can end up, watch shows that have a lot of filthy language in it. Next thing you know, you hit your thumb with a hammer and the first thought that comes to your head, even if it doesn't come out of your mouth, is the words you've been hearing. I do appreciate this is just a little aside in that regard. There's a program you can get called ClearPlay that most shows, and probably not all shows, but most shows you can run it through either this program on a computer or a machine if you're using a DVD, and it'll remove filthy language. You can specifically look and see which words it's removing. It'll use a little asterisk, but you know what the word is. Which is a great advantage to, unfortunately, it's so many programs just unnecessarily have all kinds of filthy language in it. You can also filter out inappropriate scenes. You can also filter out different levels of violence or all of it. You might get a very short program. You may watch a very short movie. Verse 29 of Ephesians 4, as Bill started with this morning, let no corrupt word proceed out of your mouth, but what is good for necessary edification, that it may impart grace to the hearers. Now, corrupt words can be certain words that are particularly vulgar and offensive, but it can also be words that the words themselves are not necessarily cuss words, not necessarily vulgarity, but they are things that are doing what the word corrupt means, which is to tear down. And there's a contrast here. There is the corrupting in the first part of this, and he says, but what is good for necessary edification? Edification means to build up. So that can be any number of things. It might be not just certain words we're using. It may be what we're saying, what we're telling somebody that is destroying them tearing them down spiritually, tearing them down morally. And it should be something that is good for edification. And these are questions that we can ask as we think about saying something. Is this going to build somebody up that's going to be tearing them down? There's also things that proceed from that. As he says at the end of that, or a few verses down in verse 31, let all bitterness, wrath, anger, clamor, and evil speaking be put away from you with all malice. These are things that we put away. And he talks about the danger, if we go back to James 3, about the way in which this is a complete contradiction. We're using our tongue to bless our God and Father. With it we bless our God and Father, and with it we curse men who have been made in the similitude of God. Out of the same mouth proceed blessing and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not so to be so. It's not consistent. We need to be using our mouth, our tongue, consistently. There's also backbiting or slander that's also mentioned in numerous places. Titus chapter 2 and verse 3. He says, he's talking about older women, that they be reverent in behavior, not slanderers, not given to much wine, teachers of good things. That word has to do with being an accuser. It's the same word that's used of the devil. The word devil comes from the same root word. It means an accuser, a slanderer, speaking evil of others. Now, this is not to be confused with lying. Sometimes we talk about backbiting or we talk about gossip, and we say, oh, well, as long as it's true, then it's not gossip. No, it's still gossip. It's still backbiting. Even if it's true, there are people we don't need to be telling things to about somebody else. If we've got a problem with somebody else, what does Jesus tell us to do? Go to them. You ever notice that? You take Matthew chapter 18, you take Matthew chapter 5. It talks about, on the one hand, someone who's been sinned against, and the other one is someone who realizes that someone has something against them. And the very thing that's said to both of them is, go. It should be that these people are meeting each other halfway to each other's house. Instead of what often happens is they're gathering up a party to be on their side. I'm going to get as many people as I can to agree with me in what I think, and they're going to get that, and then we have these kinds of divisions that exist when people are not addressing things the way God says to. And slander and gossip, sometimes, let me just make a suggestion to you. Sometimes it's not that you're the one doing it, it's the one that's listening to it. But if we're not listening to it, then the gossiper has no one to talk to except the person they need to talk to, which is the one they have the problem with. And maybe the best thing to do, if somebody starts talking to you about some problem that somebody else has, that you need to encourage them to go talk to them. And say, look, you need to go talk to this person. And then if it don't work it out, I'll go with you. And maybe if people think about, I'm going to have to talk to this person about it, maybe some of the gossip will stop. Maybe some of the backbiting will stop. There's a number of places that describe the significance of this. In Proverbs chapter 6 and verse 16, these 6 things the Lord hates. Yea, 7 are an abomination to him. A proud look, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that devises wicked plans, feet that are swift in running to evil, a false witness who speaks lies, and one who sows discord among brethren. This is not a light thing. This is a significant thing. And there's also the idea of talebearing, which is a similar thing, which is described as meddling in other men's matters. In Proverbs chapter 18 and verse 8, the words of a talebearer are like tasty trifles, and they go down to the innermost body. Remember, okay, I'm dating myself here, hee-haw. And they'd sing about, they have this gossip. No, I'm not one to go around spreading gossip. Well, really, I'm not just the gossipy kind. I'll never repeat gossip, so you better listen close the first time. Remember that? I probably didn't say that exactly the way it was worded, but that's the gist of it. Sometimes you want to hear that. Oh, something juicy gossip. Why do they call it juicy gossip? It's like that tasty trifles that he's describing there. When you hear something, why do we want to hear something bad about somebody else? Make us feel better about ourselves? I'm not sure what the exact reason is that can tend to be such a problem. But he says this is a talebearer. And this is a warning that's been given here. It affects the deep down, the way you feel about people, the trust that's there. Proverbs chapter 16 verse 28 says, a perverse man sows strife, and a whisperer. Isn't that an interesting description? A whisperer. Hey, I got something for you. I don't know why I'm thinking about I'm making movie references, but there's in Dumbo. Remember the movie Dumbo? And the elephants are getting around talking about this elephant with the big ears. And the one says, boy, do I have a trunk load of dirt. I don't get it in my mind. But that separate, there's us and there's them. Proverbs 17:9 says, he who covers a transgression seeks love, but he who repeats a matter separates friends. And connecting with the description of the fire and the tongue, in Proverbs 26 and verse 20, he says, where there is no wood, the fire goes out, and where there is no talebearer, strife ceases. 1 Peter chapter 4:15 says, let none of you suffer as a murderer, or a thief, or an evildoer, or a busybody in other people's matters. Putting that description of the busybody in with the murderer, the thief, and the evildoer ought to make a point for us. This is serious business. This doesn't need to be taken lightly. And then for Proverbs 26:17, he who passes by and meddles in a quarrel not his own is like one who takes a dog by the ears. You're in for a fight and a bite. And there's descriptions of the matter of idleness that can lead to this. We hear that there are some that walk among you in a disorderly manner, not working at all, but are busybodies. In 1 Timothy 5 and verse 13, besides they learn to be idle, wandering about from house to house, not only idle, but gossips and busybodies, saying things which they ought not. There are times when we need to approach somebody with something. But ask yourself this, if you're telling somebody about somebody else's problem, is the person you're talking to part of the problem, or are they part of the solution? And if not, keep your mouth shut. Zip it. He who has knowledge spares his words, Proverbs 17 says, and a man of understanding is of a calm spirit. Even a fool is counted wise when he holds his peace. When he shuts his lips, he's considered perceptive. So there's a lot of things that shouldn't be coming from our tongues, but there's some things that should come from our tongues. Let's look at James chapter 3 and verse 7 beginning. He says, for every kind of beasts and birds and reptile and creatures tamed and has been tamed by mankind, no man can tame the tongue. It's an unruly evil full of deadly poison. And then he says in verse 9, with it we bless our Father, our God and Father, and with it we curse men who have been made in the similitude of God. Out of the same mouth proceed blessing and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not to be. That is, there should be blessing coming, but not the cursing part. We should be blessing other people with our words, with our mouth. There should be edification. The one we read in Ephesians 4:19 not only mentions that we not let corrupt speech, but that there should be words of edification. We need to be finding ways to encourage. And he says things that impart grace to the hearers at the end of that passage. These things that are doing those things are things that are of great value. We need to be teaching truth. Ephesians 4:25, when he talks about speaking truth with his neighbor. It's not just don't say anything. We need to be speaking not just any truth. We need to speak God's truth to those that are around us. The gospel is something that has to be spread by our mouths. That's something that certainly should be coming out of our mouth. Isn't it interesting, though? We don't have any problem saying things we shouldn't say with our mouth, and yet we find it difficult to tell people the gospel and have that come out of our mouth. Acts 15 and verse 7 says, when there had been much dispute, Peter rose up and said, "Men and brethren, you know that a good while ago God chose among us that by my mouth the Gentiles should hear the word of the gospel and believe." We can think about there were times that Peter said. We even have recorded for us some of the things that Peter shouldn't have said. When he denied even knowing who Jesus was. But then a short time later, he's so glad that it was by his mouth that the gospel was preached to many others. So we just think about how each of us need to think about how we're using our mouth. Maybe there's some things that we need to say. Maybe there's some things that we don't need to say. Even in regard to salvation, when we say, do you believe that Jesus is the Son of God? That he indeed did come to this earth, that he is the Messiah, that he's the one that gave his life on the cross that we might live? And will you repent of those things that are in contrast with his will? And will you confess? And this is interesting, isn't it? As we talk about things that the mouth isn't to be used for. That in regard to our salvation, our mouth should be involved. If you confess with your mouth that Lord Jesus and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For with the heart one believes unto righteousness, and with the mouth confession is made unto salvation. And if you haven't done that, this is an opportunity to do that. But will you also be baptized? Because it's not just about the things that we say. It is a matter of us being connected with him. As we die to our old way, we're buried in baptism and raised to walk in newness of life. And as Paul was told in Acts chapter 22 and verse 16, "And now why are you waiting? Arise and be baptized and wash away your sins, calling on the name of the Lord." We invite you to do that. If we can help you that in any other way, come forward as we stand and as we sing.